This episode is brought to you by Early Innings, an anthology of the first 4 years of the Twin Bill. Featuring over 200 pages of baseball poetry, short stories, essays, interviews, comics, and art, it tells the story of what it means to love baseball today. The Athletic's Tyler Kepner said, like a box of ballpark Cracker Jack, there's a delightful surprise on every page of the Twin Bill's Early Innings. This is a collection to be savored, a loving and lyrical celebration of the art of baseball. Early Innings is available now from 406 Press. This episode is also brought to you by Ben Shahan's Short Relief. It asks the question of what happens when men are not ready to give up that boys' game, the national pastime. In 9 stories, he traces the stories of a minor league pitcher holding on to his last shred of hope for promotion to the show, little leaguers' formative experiences, and a host of men and boys in between. Short Relief is out on 406 Press and available at 406press.com. Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. 1926 was a fascinating year for baseball. There was a classic World Series full of Hall of Famers between the Yankees and the Cardinals, which included Babe Ruth hitting homers for a kid in the hospital, and had an unbelievable Game 7, and the Chicago American Giants won an equally classic Negro League World Series. In echoes of today's game, there were stars under investigation for getting wrapped up in gambling and possibly throwing games. And there was even a huge baseball fan in the White House, First Lady Grace Coolidge. Tom Wolfe's book, Baseball in the Roaring Twenties, captures all these fascinating stories. It was a really interesting chat. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Tom. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Great to be here.
Perfect. Where does this idea for the book come from?
Well, it actually came from the previous book that I wrote, which was on the 1932 season. 1932 season featured Babe Ruth, of course, and the called shot, but it also featured Rogers Hornsby. Now, Hornsby didn't that year make it to the World Series. He was a Cubs manager and got fired in early August. But the story of Ruth and Hornsby together in 1932 prompted me as a researcher and as a writer to go back and kind of look at their joint history. And I settled on 1926 because it was the year after Ruth's worst year and the year after Hornsby's best year. And they did wind up in the World Series in 1926. And in fact, the very last play of the 1926 World Series is Ruth being thrown out at second base, Hornsby tagging him. And Hornsby later said that's his greatest thrill as a baseball player. So I thought I've got this dynamic between Hornsby and Ruth to work with. The other things about 1926 was a really pivotal year for the country. I mean, we're right in the middle, right between the beginning and the ending of Prohibition, which was incredibly disruptive to the country. And we're 6 years after World War I, where there was all this optimism and enthusiasm, and you had the Roaring Twenties, and who better amplifies Roaring Twenties than Babe Ruth?
Yeah.
So I had those two pieces. One thing I had not covered in the 1932 book was black baseball. And black baseball really hit a pivot point also in 1926. And maybe we can talk about Rube Foster a little bit later because he's a really important historical figure for baseball. So there was all that going on. And then something I didn't know about as I began doing the research was this whole Cobb speaker scandal, which was a betting scandal, basically a gambling scandal alleged that occurred in a game prior to the start of the Black Sox series. So I thought I just had so many different dramatic elements to work on and to play with in this book that 1926 was just a really good year to go back and kind of address those issues.
This is obviously about the Roaring Twenties, but I want to take it back. You did mention the Black Sox scandal. And one of the things that I was fascinated about in this book is the coverage of gambling, especially in relation to how the game is today. It's a very increasingly relevant topic today. Before 1919, was gambling accepted in baseball? Was there a lot going on? What is happening with baseball and gambling up until that Black Sox series?
Well, gambling basically has existed as long as there have been events that could be bet on. You know, if there's an uncertain outcome to a physical event, people are going to bet on it. Most of the betting probably prior to the 1900s was on boxing and horse racing. But there was a lot of betting on baseball between fan to fan and players betting on games. And players were allowed to bet. They could bet on their own teams. They could bet on their own teams to win or lose. I mean, all that got changed by Judge Landis after the Black Sox scandal. 1920 is when he sort of laid down the law on that. Gambling was a huge part of the culture and huge part of the sporting culture, especially. It is, as you say, it's relevant today because we've got it commercialized and legitimized in ways that are unique, I would say, and certainly different than it was even a few decades ago. So there was lots of betting going on. Players bet small amounts with each other. The Cobb speaker scandal alleged involved much higher stakes. I mean, the four players who were alleged to have made bets on it bet between $1,000 and $2,000 each, which was, 10% of their annual salary. So they thought they had a sure thing, alleged. And I try to go into that in the book because it exemplifies, I think, what was happening in the culture a little bit. Certainly, it identifies the sort of the spirit and lawlessness of the 1920s. And it was a real headache for Judge Landis because he had laid down the law in 1920, and now here he is in 1926, having discovered this late in the season. The allegations were made back in the spring. Landis didn't know about it until the fall. So Landis was now dealing with this. And then there were a couple of other scandals that just sort of popped up, emerged that he had to deal with. And I think he makes a comment at one point to his friend of his saying, why do all these damn, gambling scandals that happened in the past, happen on my watch that I'm dealing with now 7 years later? So it's just a really, really interesting and dramatic kind of moment off the field. And because it involves several of the most prominent players in the game, it attracted a lot of attention. And probably the way Landis dealt with it was the best possible outcome for baseball, which was to kind of overlook the facts and kind of just let things be.
I think this is important for the rest of the story. But who is Dutch Leonard? That's probably a name that is not the most familiar to most people listening.
Well, there were two Dutch Leonards, and the Dutch Leonard that figures in this story was a pitcher first for the Boston Red Sox on an elite pitching staff that the Red Sox had with Babe Ruth and Ernie Shore and some others. I think Smokey Joe Wood also was with the Red Sox at that time. But he was a terrific left-handed pitcher. He was also a very hard person apparently to get along with. He made a lot of enemies as he played, and he played for both Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb. He had connections to the two managers who were sort of central in this alleged gambling thing. As a pitcher, he still holds the record for the lowest earned run average in a season. I think it's 0.96 from one of the teams. I mean, he was really a good pitcher. And in fact, one of the things that precipitated his anger at both Cobb and Speaker and why he turned on them, which is part of the story of the scandal, is that he eventually wore out his welcome and got released. And then his friends, who he thought were his friends, Cobb and Speaker, didn't jump in and, save him, sign him, and put him on a roster. I mean, when he was kind of blackballed out of baseball, he was still an effective pitcher. And he really wanted, he let things, it's pretty clear that from 1919, when this alleged gambling incident or game fixing occurred, until 1926, when he decided to reveal it, that it had been kind of weighing on him for those 7 years. He was in retirement then. He was a wealthy landowner in California. He raised grapes and figs and prunes and sold them. And he was very successful as an entrepreneur after baseball, but it really bothered him that he had been kind of blackballed out of baseball. And he saw this gambling incident as a way to get back at Cobb and at Speaker, who he thought he had betrayed him.
It's just spite is essentially what, yeah.
Yeah, and he had the evidence. I mean, one of the things I point out in the book is Smokey Joe Wood and Ty Cobb wrote letters after this game. They wrote letters to Leonard. Leonard kept them at his house in a drawer for 7 years before he physically carried them to Chicago and said, you need to pay me for these. I'm going to either give these to the newspapers or you need to give me what I was owed as a player if I had been treated fairly. So he definitely had a grudge. And he later said that he had gotten his revenge through the way that he had acted on this issue. So
we'll come back to the conclusion of this a little bit in a bit here, but I want to talk about the 1925 season, because it is somewhat pivotal for both of these teams. I mean, the book really does cover more than just the Yankees and the Cardinals here, but it is sort of the crux of the book is these two teams here. Babe Ruth has a terrible year. I mean,
Yeah.
For Babe Ruth standards, it is not a good year. What can you say about the 1925 Babe Ruth year?
He was never healthy. Why he was not healthy is not really known. He collapsed on a train. He was in the hospital. He missed 45 or 50 days. He was out of sorts with his manager. He got suspended at the end of the season because on a road trip to St. Louis, he was supposed to, show up for a game the next day, and he showed up late, and he'd apparently been visiting prostitutes over the night or the previous day. So, I mean, he was just in bad shape in terms of his spirit, morale, commitment to the team. And the Yankees in 1925 finished seventh. They were seventh out of 8 teams. Only the very lowly Red Sox were worse. So it was a very much of a down year after 3 trips to the World Series for the Yankees and for Ruth. He didn't hit 300. He missed so many games because of illness. And when the season ended, sports writers said, well, this is the end of Ruth. He's 31 years old. He's over the hill. Doesn't take care of his body. We'll never see Ruth the way he was before. So there you have Ruth kind of in the toilet of his career at age 31. And by contrast, you have Rogers Hornsby he's a player when the season begins in 1925. And during the season, he's elevated from being a player to being player manager. And he's at age 29. He's the youngest manager in the league at that point. And you might think that having that responsibility of being the manager would detract from his performance. But as it turned out, he actually hit over 400 after he was named manager. So he had probably the best career year at the end of 1925. So we have going into 1926, we have Hornsby ascending, and we have Ruth in the dumps. And that sets up the 1926 season.
Yeah. You hear these stories about Ruth, like, the hot dogs, the beer, the women. Does he change after the 1925 season?
Yeah, he takes it seriously. He takes, what has happened very seriously, and he hires a personal trainer in New York. And in the off season, he normally would go on hunting trips and, continue to carouse and drink. He was married, but I mean, that was kind of a sidelight in his life, especially at that point. But no, he signed up with basically a boxing trainer and went through these rigorous workouts. And the trainer made the point, he came on time, he followed a diet, he did the exercises. There's a really cute little video of him with this trainer. The trainer must have been a flyweight. I mean, he's about 130 pounds and Ruth is about twice that. And there's a video of the two of them boxing, supposedly, where Ruth just stands there and lets the trainer pound him. But I think that it speaks to Ruth's professionalism, which I think has been underrated. I think he was an extremely proud and dedicated athlete, and a far better athlete than people realize. He was a good base runner. He was an excellent outfielder. He would have been in the Hall of Fame as a pitcher if he'd never hit the ball out of the infield. I mean, he was really a remarkable talent, and he didn't squander that completely. Lord knows what he could have done if he was more like Ichiro Suzuki, for example. Right. But whatever he had, it worked for him. In the 6 years, if you go back and look at the statistics, the 6 years up to 1926, when Ruth was kind of at his peak with the Yankees, and then the 6 years after, from age 31 to 37, he averaged more home runs per year and more RBIs per year after age 31 than he did before age 31. And that's, I think, one of the most telling statistics about his resilience and ability to bounce back. Yeah, he's a great story. I mean, everybody who has written about him has written a good book. I mean, he's just a great source.
So we're entering the 1926 season. Obviously, the Yankees are coming off a terrible year. The Cardinals have a very young, very good manager. Are there big expectations for these teams at that time?
The expectations for the Cardinals, I think, was that they would be competitive. Hornsby recognized that he needed another outfielder, another hitter, and he needed another pitcher. So I think Hornsby went into 1926, went into spring training and came out of spring training really feeling like he had a good ball club, but not necessarily a ball club that could compete for a pennant unless it got a little few roster adjustments. As for the Yankees, nobody thought that they would be a good team, really. I mean, they were going to start rookies at second base and shortstop. Lou Gehrig was a second-year player. Ruth was coming off this terrible, terrible year. So it was a surprise that the early weeks of the season, the Yankees did pretty well. And it turned out that Miller Huggins knew how to manage the ball club. He knew how to handle young players. And Ruth had redeemed himself in Huggins' eyes, I think, because he came ready to play.
So, in 1926, do the Cardinals end up making any kind of major moves that year?
They made two major moves that were absolutely critical and really the reason that they won the pennant. Hornsby wanted an outfielder. I made a trade with John McGraw and the Giants to get Billy Southworth, who then had his career year with the Cardinals, 1926, and hit home runs and game-winning hits all the way through the pennant race in August and September. Absolutely critical for them to have Southworth's bat in the lineup. As for pitching, they needed one more pitcher. And part of that was because their ace, Jesse Haynes, had been injured early in the season, and so he was not effective early in the season. Billy Sherdell, or Wee Willie Sherdell, was a good pitcher, but he had a very slow start also. So about halfway into the season, the Cardinals were able to acquire from the Cubs a guy by the name of Grover Cleveland Alexander, who had already won more than 300 games and was in himself a kind of legend in baseball. The Cubs were willing to give him up because he was old. He was 39 years old, and he had a number of afflictions. He was epileptic. He had epilepsy, and he was alcoholic, and he was basically not taking care of his body. He was considered to be over the hill, although he had already won well over 300 games. And he was their ace down the stretch. There's an 8-game stretch in August in the middle of the pennant race when the Cardinals are just a couple games out of first place, where he gets 3 wins. He gets 1 win as a starter, 2 wins in relief. I mean, he pitched both starting and relieving down the stretch in August. I mean, he's known as a starting pitcher, and he wound up with 373 major league wins. He was the key guy going down the stretch. And of course, we'll get to the fact that he was then the hero of the 1926 World Series.
Yeah, we'll get there in just a minute. What goes right for the Yankees? How do the Yankees end up making the World Series?
They had a pretty decent pitching staff. I think what really was key for them was that Gehrig had a good year. Ruth had a comeback year. Tony Lazzeri, who was a shortstop in the minor leagues, was converted to a second baseman. It was unknown as to how much he would contribute. Miller Huggins sort of took him under his wing in a way and taught him the basics of how to play second base. He became an adequate defensive player, and Lazzeri was a very good hitter. He had a reputation in the Pacific Coast League as a power hitter, and that translated pretty well, as it turned out, into the major leagues. So it was just an up year for all of those kind of marginal players that the Yankees had, combined with a pretty solid pitching staff, which had Herb Pennock, had Wade Hoyt, both of whom were in the Hall of Fame. I mean, Bob Sharkey, Urban Shocker, who's a kind of interesting story also, who pitched through incredible health issues. So the Yankees were just a better team on the field than they were on paper in 1926. It was just one of those things. I mean, they went from 7th to 1st.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It does not happen. You go from next to first in most major league sports, not without a huge roster overhaul. And I can't think of any example where that's been more dramatic than the 25 to 26 Yankees.
We're obviously going to talk about the 7th game because that is one of the most notable games, I think, in baseball history. But the rest of the series is a very competitive back and forth series. How do we get to Game 7? What are the key things that get us to Game 7 here?
Well, as you say, it was a very closely contested series. First 2 games were in New York. Yankees won the first game. Herb Pennock outpitched Billy Sherdell. Close game, but the Yankees were just a little bit better. Second game in Yankee Stadium, Rogers Hornsby picked. He had several pitchers he could have picked for that pitching that second game, especially on the road in New York. But he gave the ball to Grover Cleveland Alexander, who pitched brilliantly, and the Cardinals won 10-2. So we have a 1-1 series going to St. Louis because they were on a 2-3-2 schedule in 1926. Game 3 is interesting for what didn't happen on the field. There's a rain delay, and policemen came to each of the dugouts with a ball that they wanted to have signed for a young boy in New Jersey named Johnny Sylvester, who had been injured and was in some distress and in the hospital. So a few of the Cardinals signed it, a few of the Yankees signed it. The ball came to Babe Ruth, and of course he signed it and did a very Ruthian thing, which was not just to sign his name, but to say, "I'll hit a home run for you tomorrow." So Ruth had promised home runs before, and he would promise home runs again, 1932 being the most famous example. It was a kind of act of boldness that was very typically Ruthian. The game resumed, and the Cardinals won, and then we go to game four in St. Louis. The Yankees at this point were scoring. I think they'd scored 2 runs, then they got shut out, then they scored 2 runs. They were not hitting at all. Actually, they had a little lecture in the clubhouse before game 4 saying, you guys better go out and play like Yankees, better score some runs. So Ruth in that game hit a home run, which was fulfilled his promise to Johnny Sylvester. Then he came up again in the middle innings, and he hit another home run. And the second home run was longer than the first. And then he hit a third home run the next time he came up, which shattered the window of a car dealership across the street. So Ruth, after the game, said, "Well, I guess I had a pretty good game." He was quite pleased with himself. Johnny Sylvester got an autographed ball. The Yankees scored 10 runs and got back in the series 4-4. Game 5, also in St. Louis, Cardinals won. So it's a 3-2 Cardinals series lead going to Game 6 back in Yankee Stadium. And who does Hornsby pitch in Game 6? Grover Cleveland Alexander. And he's not quite as sharp as he was in Game 2, but he's sharp enough to pitch a complete game. Cardinals win. That sends it to a 7th game, also in Yankee Stadium. For Grover Cleveland Alexander, I imagine that he went home and thought, well, that's, I've done a pretty good job. I got the Cardinals to the World Series. I won games 2 and 6, both in Yankee Stadium. I mean, these are games he won on the road. It's speculated that he had probably a night celebrating and was going to kind of sleep it off the next day in the bullpen, figuring that Jesse Haynes was going to pitch, and Haynes had been pitching really well. So that leads us to Game 7.
You hear these stories like, oh, he was hungover, he was drunk. Do you believe that he actually did go out after Game 6?
I don't have any research to prove that. I can't believe that he didn't have a few drinks after Game 6.
Yeah.
That would not have been a Grover Cleveland Alexander thing to do, to think, well, I'm not going to drink tonight because they might need me tomorrow. I mean, he'd done his work. I'm quite sure, I don't know how much of a bender he might have gone on, but he certainly, it's just unbelievable to me that he wouldn't have had a few drinks. So Game 7, kind of cloudy, cold weather. He was in the bullpen. We know that he was in the bullpen wrapped up in a red sweater, Cardinals red sweater, sitting out there, and did not expect to have to participate in this game.
So, Yankees get on the board first here with a Babe Ruth home run. And it's looking pretty good for the Yankees here. 4th inning, Cardinals score 3 runs. The Yankees get one back in the 6th. Haynes all of a sudden gets a blister, correct? I believe it's a blister on his hand.
Yeah.
And who does Rogers decide to put in the game at that point?
So here we are in the bottom of the 7th inning, probably one of the most talked about half innings in baseball history. And it's a 3-2 game. Cardinals are leading, but the Yankees have the bases loaded. And the hitter at the plate is Tony Lazzeri, who's the rookie, a power hitter, fastball hitter. Hornsby is playing, of course, Hornsby's a player manager, so he's out on second base. Hornsby comes into the mound, calls the other infielders in, calls in the catcher, Bob O'Farrell. And he talks to Haynes, and he says, "How are you doing?" And Haynes shows him his finger, which is bloody. Haynes is a knuckleball pitcher. He can throw a knuckleball and a fastball. And Hornsby asks him, "Can you throw the knuckleball?" And he said, "No, but I can throw the fastball." And Hornsby says, "We don't want any fastballs to this guy." So Hornsby takes Haynes, who's been the best pitcher along with Alexander in the series, takes him out. And of all the pitchers he had left who were sitting in the bullpen, this is the end of the season, only 2 innings to go in the rest of the season. Everybody there is available. He calls on Grover Cleveland Alexander. So Alexander has to walk in from the bullpen. Yankee fans are, there's a huge crowd there, I think around 50,000. And he's described as walking in, just kind of ambles in. He has his red sweater on and he ambles in. People said he always walked like wasn't going any place in a hurry. He had no place really to go to. So he walks in really slowly. And of course, while he's walking in, Larry is standing there at the plate, waiting and waiting and waiting. And Lazzeri had come up to bat with the bases loaded in a previous game in the series and had flied out. So the Cardinals were aware of his power. There's 2 outs. And so Alexander comes in. He throws, I believe, 3 warm-up pitches because he didn't like to throw a lot of warm-up pitches. He didn't like to waste energy. So, yeah, he signals to the umpire he's ready to go. Pitches to Lazzeri, who hits a long, long fly ball to left field. And there's dispute. It was fouled by 6 inches. It was fouled by 6 feet. Maybe it was fouled by 15 feet. Les Bell, who's the Cardinals' third baseman, says it was foul. It was foul all the way. That's not the way the fans reacted. It looked like it was just curved foul, and Alexander basically escaped giving up what would have been a game-winning and probably series-winning grand slam home run, changing history completely. But the ball went foul, and Alexander's next pitch is a curveball that Lazzeri swings on and misses and strikes out. So it's the most dramatic moment, as Lazzeri would later say, of Lazzeri's entire career. It's what Lazzeri is noted for. He's in the Hall of Fame. He was a great player. He said later, when he was running a bar in San Francisco, that there wasn't a single night that went by that somebody didn't come up to him and ask him about that single at-bat out of his 15-year career.
Yeah.
For Alexander, it was just, another day at the office.
And so Alexander comes in and shuts down the Yankees. There are two outs in the 9th inning. Babe Ruth up, of course. Who else would it be? Draws a walk. He draws a walk. And as you mentioned earlier here, Babe Ruth is a good base runner. He's a good ball player. We have this image of Babe Ruth as this, very large, overweight man. And he, at this time, he was not. He was a decently fast, base runner guy. He gets thrown out, as you mentioned. He gets thrown out, stealing second to end the World Series. What is going on here? Do you have any read on what is happening here in this situation?
Well, Ruth would later say that he didn't think Alexander was paying attention to him. And the other thing that I think has been missed by people who analyzed what Ruth did in the 9th inning was the only stolen base the Yankees had in the series was Ruth stealing a base when Alexander was pitching in Game 6. And Ruth in his career stole over 130 bases. Even on the 1926 team, he was the 3rd leading base stealer. And what Ruth said later was, which made a lot of sense. I mean, Bob Musil was the scheduled hitter. He was in the next hitter after Ruth walked, and Gehrig was on deck behind him. But as Ruth said, the way Alexander was pitching, we were not likely to get 2 more hits, so that he needed to get into scoring position where he could score on a single if Musil got a single, or if he stole second base, Musil likely would have been walked, and then Alexander would have pitched to Gehrig, although that was a right-handed pitcher, left-handed batter, so there was some strategy that would have to be decided by the 2 managers there. So Ruth took off on the first pitch to Musil and tried to steal second base. And Bob O'Farrell, who was a terrific catcher, and if there's one flaw I have in the book, if there's one thing I would change in the book, is I would have given more attention to Bob O'Farrell as a catcher and as a as a key ingredient in the Cardinals team in 1926. He became the most valuable player in the National League that year. He hit around 280, but he was an indispensable player and a terrific defensive catcher. And with Musil at bat as a right-handed batter, Farrell would have seen Ruth lead, and he would have seen Ruth take off immediately. And he made a perfect throw to second base. Alexander later said he just felt the ball whistle past his ear. Hornsby got it. Ruth was tagged out. Ruth stood up, shook hands with Hornsby, congratulated him, and trotted off. And the series ended on a failed stolen base by Babe Ruth in Yankee Stadium, Game 7, 9th inning, Hornsby tagging him out. You can't make
absolutely wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone knows 27's the Murderers Row Yankees. The Cardinals, however, they trade Rogers Hornsby after the World Series. Very different trajectories here. What is going on here? How does Rogers Hornsby get traded after winning the World Series?
Hornsby was an irritant to every owner he worked for, to every manager he played for, and to every owner he worked for, with the possible exception of John McGraw. He and John McGraw did seem to get along, although he only lasted 1 year with the Giants. There had been, friction between Hornsby and Branch Rickey, and also the Cardinals owner, which had existed for the whole 10 years or so that, maybe 9 years that Hornsby had been a member of the Cardinals. So yeah, at the end of the season, the owners, they had the greatest right-handed hitter ever to that point in baseball history, who had just managed his team from about a fourth place finish 1 year to a World Series championship. And they traded him. They traded him to the Giants. John McGraw was happy to get him. And the trade was for Frankie Frisch. So when we look back at the trade, at the time it looked like, what the hell was the Cardinals doing, trading away Rogers Hornsby? They got Frankie Frisch, who became a Hall of Famer. And Hornsby lasted 1 year with the Giants, went to the Boston Braves, lasted 1 year there, went to the Chicago Cubs, where he got fired in 1932, and then wound up his career mostly as a manager with the St. Louis Browns. I mean, Hornsby just didn't get along with people. And as one player said, when Hornsby put his bat down, he was a detriment to whatever team he was on.
This is not the only World Series happening this year. It's actually a pretty notable year for some very, very good baseball being played in the Negro Leagues. And what can you say about the 1926 Negro Leagues season?
Well, I want to start with Rube Foster, whose career really goes back to the late 1800s and is one of the giants really in baseball history in terms of what he accomplished with black baseball, first as a player, as a pitcher, then as a manager, then as an owner, and really as a visionary. I mean, he foresaw integration eventually in professional baseball, and tried very much to try to pair up black teams playing against white teams in Chicago, so that he had that as a kind of as a personal focus or goal. In 1925, he suffered some kind of injury due to a gas leak in an apartment and almost died. And it seemed to affect him mentally, because he deteriorated mentally in 1926. And his team, the Chicago American Giants, were the winners of one half of the season of the Negro National League. But he was hospitalized. He was institutionalized in a mental hospital in the middle of the season. And so he did not complete the season with the Chicago American Giants, who won, as I said, they won one half season. Kansas City Monarchs won the other half season. There was a playoff. And the star of that playoff happened to be Rube Foster's younger half-brother, Willie Foster, a left-handed pitcher who is also in the Hall of Fame now. He had been pitching for his college, and when his college year was over, he joined up with the Chicago American Giants, and he pitched basically them to the championship of the Negro National League. And that champion then played Atlantic City, which was the champion of the Eastern Colored League, in what was to be a best of 9 series, which turned out to require 11 games to be played, because 2 games ended in ties. Because of darkness, games had to be called. So it was only the third time that there had been a World Series between the winners of the 2 organized black leagues. And those leagues existed because of Rube Foster. He's the one who organized that. He organized what was called the Colored World Series. The first one was in 1924, the second one in 1925, and then this 1926, which was a best of 9, also went 9 games, also wound up with Willie Foster pitching the final game, which was a 1-0 win for the Chicago American Giants. They scored the only run of the game in the bottom of the 9th inning. It was every bit as dramatic as the White World Series of 1926. So those 2 World Series really pair together really well. Some writer and researcher is going to do a book, I'm sure, on those personalities and those 2 World Series that existed basically in a parallel universe.
One of my favorite characters in the book is Grace Coolidge. Who is Grace Coolidge?
Well, Grace Coolidge was married to probably the dullest man to ever be president, Coolidge.
We could only be so lucky. Yeah, that's
yes. Right. She was a terrific baseball fan. She was a baseball fan from the time she went to college. I believe she's the first lady to have ever graduated from a four-year college. She learned scorekeeping, kept score of her college teams. She was a huge baseball fan, a huge Washington Senators fan. And the Senators, of course, had been in the World Series in both 24 and 25. So she did have a disappointing year in 1926. She was fanatic about baseball, and when Calvin Coolidge left the White House and they went back to Boston, she shifted her allegiance from the Washington Senators to the Boston Red Sox. She was given a lifetime pass. She continued to follow baseball all of her life, and I tried to give the last word in the book actually to Grace Coolidge. She's the last person I mentioned in the epilogue, and the last line I gave to her is a quote of hers, which is basically, I'm paraphrasing, the rest of you may not care about baseball, but baseball is my life.
What ends up happening to Cobb and Speaker?
Well, the letters that had been written by Wood and Cobb to Dutch Leonard eventually wound up in the hands of Judge Landis, who then wanted to interview everybody who was involved. Dutch Leonard would not leave California to come and be interviewed. He said people get shot on the streets in Chicago, and he's not coming to Chicago. So Landis went to California to interview him there. Cobb and Speaker, of course, were interested in clearing their names. They had actually been told by Ban Johnson, who's the president of the American League, that because of this scandal that he was trying to suppress, they would not be allowed to continue. They needed to resign. So Cobb and Speaker resigned and then had second thoughts and took their case basically to Judge Landis, who did his best, I think, to try to gather evidence and then actually published in the newspaper the transcripts of his interviews with Cobb and Speaker and Wood, all of whom denied that the game was fixed. What Leonard alleged was that Speaker, after the previous game, came and spoke to them and said, I know my team's going to lose tomorrow, so we might as well bet on it. He didn't actually say that they were going to fix it in any way, but this is Cobb and Speaker speaking to each other are the managers of the two teams. Leonard is not going to play in the game because he pitched the day before. Smokey Joe Wood is not going to play in the game. Weirdly enough, it was Cobb's team that was supposed to win. He only got one hit. Speaker's team was supposed to lose. He got 3 hits, including 2 doubles. So their performance on the field doesn't indicate that the game was fixed. But it was an end-of-the-season game. It was played in Detroit. The Indians players wanted to get back to Cleveland on the train so they didn't have to take a boat. So there was no incentive for them to win. The game itself was played, this is a 9-inning game in which there were 24 runs scored, some 30-some hits. It was played in 1 hour and 6 minutes. So basically, neither team wanted to win. Whether there's really no evidence that the game was fixed in terms of anybody performing differently than they would normally perform. But the bet, as it turned out, they couldn't get the money placed because it was too large an amount of money to bet. And I think that's what saved Landis from having to discipline any of the players, that it was kind of a failed attempt to gamble on a game that they think they knew the outcome of. There wasn't evidence of game fixing, and Landis at this point didn't need another scandal. And 7 years had passed since this game had been played. 6 years had passed since Landis dealt with a Black Sox schedule. I think Landis did what he thought was best for baseball, which was kind of to ignore it and then reinstate Cobb and Speaker, who played 2 more years. Each of them played 2 more years. They wound up as teammates on the Athletics in their final seasons. And I think Landis was also conscious of the fact that Speaker and Cobb were huge figures in baseball. They were from a different era, and their era was ending. But I don't think Landis wanted to do anything to damage baseball. And there's been some good scholarship written about, what he should have done and exactly, what the legal issues were, how credible Dutch Leonard was as the instigator of the investigation.
The book is fascinating. There's all sorts of stuff that I did not know. It is so much more than just a Yankees Cardinals book. It really gives you a sense of time, and all the gambling stuff, again, is incredibly relevant for things we are still seeing very commonly in today's game. It's fantastic. I loved it. Thank you so much, Tom. This has been great.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
That was Tom Wolfe. His book, Baseball in the Roaring Twenties, the Yankees, the Cardinals, and the captivating 1926 season, is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. Until next time,